Have you ever watched a man spend 40 years learning something, really learning it, down to the smell of the soil and the weight of a wet season, and then watched the world shrug and walk away? Let me tell you about Clément Ouellet, not the version of him people in Rivière-du-Loup talked about at the co-op feed store, where they'd shake their heads and say he was stubborn. Not the version his brother-in-law described at Christmas dinner, still doing things the old way, said, with the particular smile Canadians reserve for people they've quietly given up on. Let me tell you about the real Clément, the one who showed up at 5 in the morning when the frost was still hard on the ground, who kept records in a green notebook that went back to 1987, who knew, not guessed, not hoped, but knew that what he was doing mattered. It just took everyone else a long time to figure that out. Clément was 53 years old when the seed company rep first came to his farm outside Saint-André-de-Kamouraska. The rep's name was Darvaux. That was how he introduced himself, just Darvaux, the way men do when they've handed out enough business cards to stop bothering with first names. He drove a white pickup that was too clean for a man claiming to understand agriculture, and he had the relaxed confidence of someone who had memorized a presentation and mistaken that for knowledge. The farm itself was modest by most measures. 112 acres of dark river-bottom soil that Clément's father had broken and his grandfather had dreamed about. A red hip-roof barn that had been repaired so many times it was more a philosophy than a structure. 2 grains silos. A root cellar that stayed cool even in August. And behind the root cellar, in a long, low building that had once been a chicken coop, Clément kept what he called his library. It wasn't books in there, it was seeds. Thousands of them, cataloged by variety, by year, by yield performance, by disease resistance in wet years versus dry. He had heritage tomato varieties that hadn't been commercially available since the 1960s. Squash strains his father had traded for at a church auction in 1974. Dry beans in 17 distinct colors, each one adapted over generations to the short, hard summers of the lower St. Lawrence Valley. He had sweet corn that tasted the way sweet corn used to taste before it was engineered to survive a shipping container. He had a potato variety, firm, yellow-fleshed, slightly nutty, that had no name in any catalog he'd ever found, which he simply called the Kamouraska, because that was where it had always been. Darvaux walked through the seed library with his hands in his pockets and said, politely, that it was impressive. Then he explained why Clément should stop. The company he represented, Darvaux said the name twice, as if Clément might not have heard of it, which he had because everyone had developed a new line of certified seed varieties, high yield, disease-resistant, optimized for mechanized harvest, licensed, which meant replanting your own saved seed was technically a legal issue now. They were offering a transition package. Good pricing for the first 3 years, a preferred grower agreement. Real money, Darvaux said. The kind of money that makes sense. Clément listened to the whole thing. He didn't interrupt. He stood in his seed library in his barn coat and his rubber boots, and he let Darvaux finish, and then he asked one question. What happens to yield in a wet spring? Year like 2019? Darvaux said the varieties were tested across a wide range of conditions. Clément nodded slowly. He opened the green notebook to a page dated May 2019 and showed it to Darvaux, row by row, field by field, variety by variety. The numbers told a story that no brochure had prepared Darvaux for, the certified seed lines that 3 of Clément's neighbors had switched to that year had failed or dramatically underperformed in the wet conditions. Clément's heritage varieties, adapted over decades to exactly this kind of spring, had come through, not perfectly, but through. Darvaux looked at the notebook. He said that was interesting data. Then he left, and Clément went back to work. That was the thing about him that people misread as stubbornness. It wasn't stubbornness. It was a complete absence of interest in being right in front of an audience. He wasn't saving seeds to make a point. He wasn't keeping the green notebook to win an argument someday. He did it because the knowledge lived in the doing, and the doing had to continue, or the knowledge died with it. His father had told him that. His father's father had understood it without being told. The years after Darvaux's visit were not easy. 3 of the 4 neighboring farms within 2 kilometers of Clément's land signed the preferred grower agreements. The 4th, old Jules Beauséjour, who was 71 and had the suspicious disposition of a man who'd seen several agricultural revolutions come and go, held out for another season, then sold his farm to his nephew, who signed the agreement immediately. The co-op started stocking almost exclusively the new certified lines. The Agricultural Extension Office held seminars on modern seed management, and the materials they handed out didn't mention seed saving at all, as though it were a practice so outdated it had already been archived. At the Kamouraska County Farm Show in the fall, Clément set up a small table with samples of his dry beans and his heritage squash. A young agronomist from Laval came by. Her name was Tremblay, he remembered, because she mentioned her grandfather had farmed near Rivière-Ouelle, and she spent 45 minutes at his table asking questions he hadn't expected anyone to ask. She knew about genetic diversity. She knew about the Irish famine and what monoculture failure looked like across a century of agricultural history. She asked if she could photograph his catalog. He said yes. She came back the following spring with 2 graduate students and spent a weekend documenting the collection. She called it, in a paper she was writing, a living seed bank of remarkable regional specificity. Clément read that phrase several times. He wasn't sure how to feel about it. He was glad someone had noticed, but something about the word remarkable bothered him, as though it was remarkable that a farmer had done what farmers had always done, simply because most of them had stopped. The graduate students were enthusiastic and asked intelligent questions and ate lunch at his kitchen table and said the kind of things that made him think the next generation might be all right after all. Then they went back to the city, and he went back to the fields, and things continued the way they had been, for a while. The first sign came in the summer, 3 years after Darvaux's visit. One of the neighboring farms, the Saguenay family, 2nd generation, father and son operation, had planted the full licensed line that season. They'd done everything right. The rep had been out twice. The soil tests were good. The inputs were calibrated. And then June came in wet, and it stayed wet through most of July, and the certified potato variety they'd planted in the east field developed late blight in a way that spread faster than anything old Georges Saguenay had seen in 30 years of farming. He lost 60% of that field. He drove to Clément's place on a Tuesday afternoon with a look on his face that Clément recognized. The look of a man who has been confident for a long time and is now recalculating everything. "Your potato," Georges said, "the yellow one. You got any seed left from last year?" Clément took him into the cellar and showed him what he had. He had plenty. He always had plenty, because abundance in storage was one of the principles he'd inherited along with the farm. Georges didn't say thank you right away. He stood in the cellar for a moment looking at the neatly labeled wooden crates. He said, "I thought you were crazy." "I know," Clément said. "I told my son you were crazy. That's all right." Georges bought enough seed for an emergency late planting in the one field where the blight hadn't reached. It was a gamble at that point in the season, but the Kamouraska potato was an early variety, compact, reliable, and it did what it had always done. It produced, not a full harvest, but enough to pull some of the season back from disaster. Word moves differently in rural Quebec than people from cities imagine. It doesn't travel the way gossip travels, loud and fast and in all directions. It moves the way water moves through heavy soil, slow, quiet, through connections you can't always see, following the path of least resistance until suddenly it's everywhere. By the following spring, 2 other farms had reached out to Clément asking about seed stock. Not through any formal channel, just a phone call. Just, "Do you have any of that yellow potato?" Or he did. He always did. And then the thing happened that nobody in the region had been prepared for, though several people, Clément among them, had quietly thought about it. The company whose certified seed lines captured most of the regional market announced a supply disruption. The language in the letter was careful and full of passive voice, the kind of writing that describes a catastrophe while trying not to use any word that admits anything went wrong. The core of it was this: the seed production facility they relied on in another province had experienced a significant processing failure. Inventory for the coming season was substantially reduced. Growers under the preferred agreement would receive a portion of their normal allocation. How much depended on acreage tier and contract length. For most farms in the region, the practical meaning was simple. They needed seed they didn't have, from a source that no longer existed, for a planting season that was 8 weeks away. Clément read the letter. A copy had been circulated through the county agricultural office, and then he went out and walked his fields for an hour. The ground was still frozen at the edges, just starting to give in the south-facing sections. The sky was the particular gray of early April in the lower St. Lawrence, the kind of gray that could turn into anything. He thought about the green notebook. He thought about the rows of labeled crates in the root cellar. He thought about Darvaux and his clean white truck and the phrase "preferred grower agreement." And he thought about all the knowledge that had left this county in the past decade because nobody had thought it worth keeping. Then he went inside and got the phone. It was a Wednesday. By Friday afternoon, he had received 14 calls from within the county. By the following Wednesday, he'd heard from farms as far away as Témiscouata and Montmagny. The Laval agronomist, Tremblay, called and asked if she could send her graduate students again, this time to actually help instead of just document. He said yes. The conversations were not easy. Some of the farmers who called had been dismissive in the past. Some had said things in public, at co-op meetings, that Clément was aware of. Farming communities are small and sound carries. But he didn't bring any of that up. That wasn't the point of any of this. The point was the seed and the season, and the fields that needed to be planted in 6 weeks, regardless of what anyone had said about anyone at a co-op meeting 3 years ago. What happened next was quiet and practical and completely unglamorous, which is the way most of the important things in agriculture actually happen. Clément allocated his stock carefully. He kept back what he needed for his own planting. That came first, always, because a farmer who gives away his own seed to be generous and then fails his own harvest has not helped anyone, and then he worked through the requests methodically. He prioritized smaller operations, the ones without the financial reserves to absorb a bad season. He was honest about what he had and what he didn't. He kept meticulous records of what went where, partly because that was his nature and partly because Tremblay had asked him to. Georges Saguenay's son, a young man of 28 named Elie, who had been the most openly skeptical of the old way thinking, drove out on a gray Thursday morning to pick up his allocation. He came alone without his father, which Clément thought was deliberate. Elie loaded the seed crates into his truck with the particular efficiency of a young man who works hard and doesn't want to appear to need anyone's help. Before he left, he stopped at the side of the truck and turned back. "We should have listened," he said. He didn't look at Clément when he said it. He looked at the barn. Clément said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "How's your east field draining now? You did any tiling in that section?" Elie blinked. "Not yet. Worth thinking about before you put anything in there. I'll show you where the water pools in a wet spring if you want." And they walked the field together, an old farmer and a young one, talking about drainage and soil structure, and what the ground tells you if you've been watching it long enough. The seed was in the truck. The season was coming. That was what mattered. The Agricultural Extension Office sent a representative out in May, a different one from the seminars, a woman named Arcand who was direct and asked good questions. She wanted to document what Clément had done. She used the word resilience, and she used the phrase traditional ecological knowledge. And she asked if he'd be willing to speak at a regional conference in the fall. He said he'd think about it. He was still thinking about it when the season started in earnest, and the thinking got replaced by work, the way it always does when the ground thaws and the planting windows open, and there's no time for anything except what's in front of you. The harvest that fall was not a record. It wasn't supposed to be. The farms that had scrambled for alternative seed had planted late and under pressure, and in some cases in fields that weren't ideal. But the crops came in. Across the county, in fields that had been desperate in April, things grew. The Kamouraska potato showed up in cellars from here to Témiscouata. Heritage beans were harvested on farms that hadn't grown them in a generation. A squash variety that hadn't existed in regional commerce for 30 years appeared in a roadside stand outside Rivière-du-Loup with a handwritten sign that just said local. Ask us. Clément drove past that stand on a Saturday in October and didn't stop because he was on his way to check on his own fields and he was already running late. But he saw it. He saw it and he noted it the way he noted everything. Quietly in the back of his mind, filed next to everything else that was worth remembering. That evening he sat at the kitchen table with the green notebook open in front of him and entered the season's numbers. Yields, varieties, performance by field and by week. He noted the unusual spring conditions and how each variety had responded. He noted what to try differently. He added 2 new notes at the bottom of the final page, observations about drainage patterns in the south field that had occurred to him while he was walking with Elie Saguenet in April. He didn't write anything about being right. He didn't write anything about Darvaux or the preferred grower agreements or the supply disruption letter. None of that was the point. The point was the knowledge, and the knowledge lived in the notebook now, and next spring someone would need it, and it would be there. He closed the notebook and put it back in its place on the shelf beside the others. 37 years of green notebooks lined up in order, the whole record of one farm and one life and one way of understanding that the ground beneath your feet has a memory, and your job is to keep it. There are thousands of Clément Ouellets scattered across this country.
You probably know one.
Maybe you grew up next door to one, or your grandfather was one, or you drove past one's farm 100 times without ever stopping to ask what they knew. The question worth sitting with is this: how many of them are we willing to lose before we start paying attention?